Hi, I'm Philip Samartzis. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Art at RMIT University, and I'm also the Artistic Director of the Bogong Centre for Sound Culture. I'm a sound artist and curator, and I'm particularly interested in field recording and in particular modes of practice around composing with environmental sounds. So some of the terms that often are associated with the idea of composition, employing environmental, natural, anthropogenic sound, things like soundscape composition, acoustic ecology, bioacoustics, and in the broader sense, sound art often uses environmental sounds or the sounds of the everyday that surround you. So we're not necessarily talking about rarefied environments such as wilderness ecologies, which is something that I do, but they can also be the sounds of the everyday, of your homes, of your immediate environment. And so why field recording and why everyday sound? Everyday sound's been a fascination for composers, particularly in the late 19th century into the 20th century, the rise of modernism, and trying to extend the palette of the orchestra through non-musical sounds. So some of the famous composers of the era, such as Edgar Varese, as well as Ottorino Respighi, used extra musical sounds to enhance their orchestral compositions. With Varese, Amerik is a famous example where he uses anvils and sirens to bring in the everyday, the awakening of the city, in this instance New York City, to extend the musical vocabulary that he was working with. Ottorino Respighi used recordings of birds to exemplify a kind of a natural forested environment within his work, The Pines of Rome. So environmental sound has had a lovely relationship with modern 20th century classical music for a long period of time, and with the rise of new recording methodologies and technologies such as the phonograph, the tape recorder, the rise of radio as well in the 30s, new microphones and new technologies, artists and engineers and recorders started to look at other ways of making music, other ways of combining instrumental sound with non-instrumental sound. And so that's where field recording has become kind of such a vital element of contemporary music practice. In my own example, I tend to work in wilderness environments. My work is more politically orientated, particularly in relation to things like global warming and its global impacts. So I use field recording to visit places like Antarctica, the Australian Alps, the Swiss Alps, to make sound recordings of often extreme forces occurring in those environments as a way of kind of exemplifying what global warming sounds like, what it feels like, how one as an artist can use contemporary technologies to create those embodied listening experiences. And by that I mean something that's immersive and tactile and physical, and through the agency of loudspeakers and big sound systems, for instance, you can create really quite visceral experiences of environmental conditions, not dissimilar to a rock concert, in which amplified music is being used to kind of create a very heightened experience of a set of songs or a composition. So sound art, and by its extension field recording, soundscape composition, might be a new way of thinking about sound. It really stems from a shift in perception of what music actually is. It tends to emerge from the kind of, post-war period, from the trauma of both the First and Second World Wars, and how everything, culture in particular in Europe and America, was reconsidered through trauma, and how the past was associated with a certain kind of social and political upheaval, and how new technologies and new artistic practices were used to suggest potentially a modern kind of utopia, a new way of thinking about the world separate to what had preceded it. And so field recording in particular is central to this, in the sense that it's related to listening. and listening is related to perception. And a lot of it can be attributed to John Cage and his work 433, a performance that David Tudor presented in Woodstock around 1952, in which he performed at a piano but didn't play anything of the piano. And what that did was heighten the audience's attention to what was, the term would be diegetic sound, the sound within the auditorium. Not the musical sound of the piano, but the sound of the audience rustling and coughing and spluttering, that kind of thing. And the external sounds that one can hear from outside the auditorium, traffic passing by, birds, wind rustling, that kind of thing. So that work is significant because John Cage's position is that all sound is music, and music is very, very singular, very specific to each of us as listeners, hence why different people like different music. You might like Slayer, someone else might like Chopin, I might like the sound of my toilet kind of flushing, you know, but to all of us it's a musical form. It's born of rhythm, timbre, texture, space, all the kind of musical elements that you might consider as a composer can be applied to any oral experience. In terms of the practice of field recording, I became interested in what's known as a post-studio practice of working in the field rather than in a studio environment. Right now I'm sitting in a lovely bespoke studio with beautiful acoustics, high-end synthesizers and other kind of software based technology as well. But what I find within these particular environments is that the studio produces a set of constraints in how I work and how I think and how I listen to music. And that to me ends up resulting in a predictable set of outcomes. And what I found is that I wanted to kind of disrupt my practice by working in a set of conditions that I didn't control. So something that was antithetical to the studio environment. So going out into the field and losing myself within a culture or a country or a wilderness which wasn't my own, in which I didn't speak the language, in which I had no control over the conditions, forced me to rethink how I worked as a composer, as a sound artist, the choices that I would make, the way I would address problems or just engage in problem solving, the way I communicated to people in the field, were all part of the process, part of the outcome that I was producing. So all of that kind of is known within a fine art context as post-studio practice. In terms of the technology, I could take my laptop out in the field so I could compose immediately within the dynamics that I found myself within. Also, there's a whole range of new technologies around handheld recorders and microphones that allow you to do quite remarkable things in these types of uncontrolled conditions as well, to get quite high caliber outcomes. The way I usually work is not that dissimilar to working in a studio. So my history as a sound engineer is one where I would use different types of microphones to record different instruments, musicians, instrumentalists, that kind of thing. But now the field is my orchestra, so I use different microphones to record the wind, the water, the birds, anthropogenic sounds such as construction, tourism, other kinds of activities one might find depending on where you are. As I mentioned, I tend to work in quite extreme wilderness ecologies, so often I'm battling extreme cold, extreme wind, sometimes desert environments too, where it's really, really hot and dusty. But it's those very conditions that have unique acoustic qualities to them. And in many respects, I'm trying to take my studio practice, that really refined art of recording an orchestra or a music ensemble, and applying it to these unwieldy sounds of nature in some form of distress. And that's the beauty of working in the field, is that you can produce really quite unique and remarkable outcomes through the same processes that you would apply within a normal kind of concert or recording studio situation. So when you're thinking about field recording, in particular environmental sound, and also the way we perceive and listen to environmental sound, a good a good test for anyone is to sit in your own particular domestic environment and tune yourself to the environmental sounds that surround you. They're the sounds that are often filtered out of your daily lives and are often overlooked, but they're very much the fabric of your daily experience. And it's always noteworthy to kind of listen to your fridge, as I mentioned earlier, the cistern of your toilet, whether you hear bird call or traffic, the neighbours arguing, all those kinds of things, because it gives you a deeper sensorial engagement with your own particular environment. And you can take that experience and apply it to any other external environment. Often when I walk to the tram or train, I'm attentively listening to the environment and trying to note all the things that make up a space, because they're all unique. There's no real common denominator within every space. They're all unique. They're all a composite of thousands of different acoustic interactions. And whilst I might say, yes, you have a fridge that makes a certain sound, every fridge is in fact unique, and some rattle and some hum in very, very specific ways. Traffic also functions very, very differently depending on the acoustics, whether it's a closed environment, a concrete one, as well as an open expansive space. So taking all that into consideration gives you a heightened understanding of acoustics, of spatiality, and the material nature of sound as you're listening to them within your own particular everyday environments.